Greetings, everyone. I'm David Adler, president of the Alturas Institute. Last time we met, I gave you 4 reasons why President Donald Trump could not pardon himself, despite his assertion of authority to do so. You've responded with wonderful questions and comments, and today I want to respond to 4 questions. Let's get started. First question: can Vice President Mike Pence pardon President Donald Trump? That's a fine question. The answer is no. The Vice President does not enjoy a constitutional power to grant pardons. That's attached solely to the office of the presidency. So the only way in which Mike Pence might be able to pardon Donald Trump is if Donald Trump resigns the presidency, Mike Pence becomes president, and suddenly that opportunity is available to him. The question arises, would Mike Pence pardon Donald Trump? Would this be the result of a trade, a quid pro quo? Would Donald Trump say to Pence, I'll resign the presidency so that you can become president? Why would Mike Pence do this? Let's understand that a decision by Mike Pence to pardon Donald Trump would utterly destroy his career. He would never be able to pursue office successfully again. It would be the case, moreover, that his opportunities for commercial jobs in the private sector would likewise be unavailing. Who would want to hire the person who pardoned a man who is going to be the subject of numerous criminal probes, who turned his back on Americans through his indifference to a suitable pandemic plan, and who was unwilling to cooperate with President-elect Joe Biden in a smooth transition to office? So I think Mike Pence would not be interested in doing this. But there's a better historical context. Let me take you back to August of 1974, when Richard Nixon was worrying greatly about his future because he too was likely to face criminal probes, which he wanted to avoid. And according to a number of stories, he asked his chief of staff, Alexander Haig, to approach then Vice President Gerald Ford and offered a deal that Gerald Ford could accept the presidency in exchange for his willingness to grant a pardon to Richard Nixon, sparing Nixon the calamity of a criminal trial. People wondered, is this true? Is it possible that Gerald Ford made a deal? Because right after he assumed the presidency upon Nixon's resignation on August 8, 1974, Gerald Ford appeared before the House Judiciary Committee where he was asked the question, will you pardon Richard Nixon? Ford's response was, no, the nation would not stand for it. Any pardon before trial would be premature. He would not do it. And yet, a month later, Gerald Ford did, in fact, grant a pardon to Richard Nixon. He said, I hereby grant a pardon to Richard Nixon for all crimes that he has committed or may have committed against the United States from 1968 until that date in September of 1974. This shocked the nation, and it led journalists and writers to investigate the possibility of whether a deal had been cut between Nixon and Ford. Some very prominent writers determined that, in fact, he had accepted such a deal. And so as time passed over the years, that question had never been answered. In my own case, let me share a personal story with you. Years later, many years later, when Gerald Ford came to my university while I was a doctoral student, I was so lucky to be included in a small group of people to have lunch with Gerald Ford. And I just thought, this is my responsibility. I need to know the truth. I'm going to ask the former president if he cut a deal. And so I raised that question. The look on President Ford's face when I asked that question wasn't necessarily a pleasant one. I imagine he was asking himself, who is this cocky student asking this question from the past? But he answered, and he said, no, I made no such deal. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. This truth comes to you from me on that question. He didn't cut a deal, but that's the historical context that Mike Pence would be looking at because it would very much color his legacy from now until the end of his life. And there's a further story to be told here. When Gerald Ford, after pardoning Richard Nixon, ran unsuccessfully for election to the presidency in 1976. He lost very narrowly to Jimmy Carter, and studies showed that probably Ford's defeat in that election could be attributable to his decision to pardon Richard Nixon. Bad news for Gerald Ford, and people will always wonder, what if he had not pardoned Richard Nixon? Would he have been elected to the presidency? Another fine question from an audience member asks, aren't presidential pardons simply executive orders? And therefore, if Mike Pence were to pardon Donald Trump, that order could be overturned by President-elect Joe Biden once he assumed office on January 20. That's a very thoughtful question, but the answer is no. A presidential pardon rises above a mere executive order. The presidential pardon power, after all, is articulated in Article 2 of the Constitution, giving the president the authority to pardon all offenses against the United States. An executive order can, in fact, be inferred from some of the president's constitutional powers, but usually they reflect some statutory authority delegated to the president. And while executive orders can certainly be overturned, there's nothing in our history, nothing in the Constitutional Convention, nothing in the text of the Constitution, for that matter, to indicate that a presidential pardon could be overturned or repealed. So once it's been extended, it's a done deal, and that's reflective of Supreme Court decisions over 200 years. Another very fine question asks whether or not the president's pardon power can extend to state offenses. This is very important because, as everybody knows, it's not merely the case that Donald Trump is likely to be confronted with federal probes, some of a criminal nature, but more likely he will be faced with several state probes that could lead to prolonged trials. And so the question arises, what if he was pardoned by Mike Pence under this hypothetical? Could he, in fact, be spared state trials? The answer is no. The framers of the Constitution made it very clear that, in fact, the pardon power extends only to federal offenses, hence the language in Article 2. The presidential pardon power extends to all offenses against the United States. The framers did not want the president to enjoy a presidential pardon power to scuttle state criminal investigations. One of our viewers asked, isn't it necessary for someone to commit a crime before they can be the recipient of a presidential pardon? Fine question, but the answer is no. The framers of the Constitution contemplated circumstances in which the availability of the pardon power would be very effective and important, even in cases where a criminal offense had not yet been committed. Here's the explanation for that. In 1786, in the famous period known as Shays' Rebellion, when farmers in the western part of that state rose up in rebellion to stop judges from foreclosing on their homes and farms, the only way to end that rebellion, so thought the governor of Massachusetts, was to offer a pardon to the farmers and to say, lay down your pitchforks and return to your homes. Nobody will be prosecuted. Nobody will face trial. And the farmers threw down their pitchforks, went home, and that's how Shays' Rebellion was ended in a relatively bloodless way. That event very much influenced the thinking of our founding fathers as they wrote Article 2 and granted the pardon power to the president. They wanted a president to have the authority to grant a pardon to rebels as a means of ending a rebellion, even before any crimes were committed. So we learn from the framers' own understanding of Shays' Rebellion, their own discussions and debates in Philadelphia, that a pardon power can in fact be granted before a crime is committed. And that's exactly what Gerald Ford did when he pardoned Richard Nixon for all crimes or crimes against the United States that he may have committed. And in our hypothetical involving Vice President Pence, should he ascend to the presidency, he could in fact pardon Donald Trump and grant him a pardon for all offenses that he has committed or may have committed against the United States during a specified period of time. So thanks everybody for joining us. I appreciate your questions, your engagement with Alturas is very important. So if you like this talk, by all means, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Again, I'm David Adler, president of the Alturas Institute. Thanks for joining us.